The fire was still chewing through the roof when I arrived, but the thing that stopped me wasn't the flames. It was my father standing barefoot in the gravel, staring at the blackened skeleton of the garage he had spent 42 years building. His name was Daniel Mercer, 71 years old. Grease permanently worked into the lines of his hands, a retired mechanic who could identify an engine by the sound it made 3 buildings away. That morning, he had lost everything that couldn't be replaced. His lifts were twisted metal, his tool cabinets were warped open, family photographs had curled into ash. The old blue pickup he'd promised to leave to me was nothing but a burned frame. I stepped out of my truck and felt the heat strike my face. My father didn't turn around. "They came after midnight," he said. His voice was almost flat. 6 bikes, maybe 7, they poured something around the doors and started it. I looked at the ruin, then I looked at him. "Did you see who they were?" He finally turned. His eyes were red, but he wasn't crying. I saw their colors. That was enough. The Black Vultures Motorcycle Club had been circling his garage for weeks, demanding protection money from local businesses. Dad had refused them every time. He believed the garage was his property, and his customers deserved better than to pay criminals for the privilege of operating in peace. I had warned him that people like that didn't accept no easily. He had laughed and told me I worried too much. Now the laugh was gone. "My name is Evan Mercer. For 12 years I served as a Heavy Ordnance Specialist in the military, but my father never cared about the title. To him, I was still the boy who scraped his knee learning to ride a bicycle behind that garage. He didn't know that my service had taught me something more valuable than technical skill. It taught me patience. It taught me how to document a threat before confronting it, and it taught me that revenge was usually the least intelligent answer to injustice. I walked through the wreckage with him. Every step crushed something that used to belong to our family: a socket, a photograph, a piece of the wooden sign he'd made himself. Then I noticed something strange beneath the burned remains of his office. A metal box had survived the fire. Dad saw me looking at it. "That's why I called you," he said. "I found it after they left." I opened the box. Inside was a stack of papers sealed in plastic, along with a small flash drive. On top was a handwritten list of names, 7 names, 7 men, and beside the first 3 were dates from the previous week. I felt the air change. Dad had not only survived the attack, he had been collecting evidence. But why had he never told me, and what exactly had he discovered before the garage burned? My father had always been stubborn, but there was a difference between stubbornness and preparation, and that list proved he had crossed that line without telling me. We sat on the tailgate of my truck while firefighters finished checking the ruins for hotspots. Dad handed me the flash drive. "I don't know what's on it," he said. "I copied everything I had before they came." I looked at him. "Everything?" He nodded. "Invoices, messages, names, license plates, pictures. They thought I was just an old mechanic." A bitter smile touched his face. That was their mistake. I took the drive home and opened it on an isolated computer. There were photographs of motorcycles outside businesses, screenshots of threatening messages, recordings of phone calls, copies of envelopes containing demands for money, and several videos captured from cameras around the garage. The videos changed everything. The Black Vultures hadn't simply been threatening my father, they had been systematically intimidating half a dozen small businesses along the highway. A diner owner had paid them twice. A landscaping company had closed after receiving threats. A convenience store manager had been assaulted. Dad had become the one man who refused to bend. But then I found the final folder. It contained a video recorded 3 nights before the fire. The image was grainy, but the voices were clear enough. A man named Victor Rains stood beside 2 motorcycles and talked about making an example out of my father. Another man asked whether anyone would interfere. Victor laughed. "His son won't. He's always somewhere overseas." My hands tightened around the edge of the desk. They had no idea I had been home for 6 weeks. They didn't know I'd spent my career working around dangerous equipment and high-risk operations. More importantly, they didn't know that I understood the difference between a threat and evidence. I called Detective Laura Bennett, a local investigator I had met years earlier through a veterans community program. She arrived with 2 officers and watched the footage without saying much. When it ended, she rewound it. "This is enough to start building a case," she said, "but we need more." I asked what she meant. She explained that the fire itself would be investigated, but a prosecution required a chain of evidence that couldn't be easily challenged. The recordings, photographs, and messages were useful, but the suspects would claim the footage had been manipulated or taken out of context. Dad shook his head. So they burn my life down and we wait? Laura looked directly at him. No, we build the case correctly. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent years in environments where a single mistake could kill people. The lesson was always the same. Rushing because you were angry was how you lost control. So I didn't chase Victor. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even contact him. Instead, I helped Detective Bennett organize everything Dad had collected. Then we discovered something that made the fire look like only one piece of a much larger operation. Hidden among Dad's records was a payment ledger from a business owner who had secretly cooperated with investigators. The names on it weren't just bikers. One name belonged to a county official. Another belonged to a security contractor, and the third was someone Dad recognized immediately. That man, he whispered, came to the garage 2 days before the fire. Why would a county official be paying a motorcycle club that had just burned down my father's business? The answer arrived 2 days later when Detective Bennett called me before sunrise. She told me not to come to the station. Instead, she asked me to meet her at a small diner outside town. When I arrived, she was already sitting in the back booth with a folder beside her coffee. We found the financial connection, she said. The county official wasn't merely paying the bikers. He was using them to pressure property owners into selling land below market value. My father's garage sat on one of the most valuable pieces of commercial property along the highway. A development company wanted the entire block for a large construction project. Dad had refused every offer because the garage was his home as much as his business. Victor Rains and his club had been hired indirectly to intimidate him into leaving. The fire wasn't random. It was part of a pressure campaign. Suddenly, the burned garage made sense. It wasn't about protection money, it was about removing an obstacle. Detective Bennett slid another photograph across the table. It showed Victor meeting a man named Carlton Shaw in a parking garage. Shaw was the development company's regional manager. We've got enough to investigate, Bennett said, but not enough to make everyone disappear behind bars. I leaned back. Then we keep going. She studied me. Evan, I know your background. I also know you're angry. Don't do anything stupid. I almost smiled. I came here because I don't want to. She nodded slowly. That was the truth. My anger was enormous, but I understood where it could lead. I had seen people lose everything because they let rage make decisions for them. My father had spent his life fixing broken things. I wasn't going to destroy another life trying to repair his. We began working with a state investigative unit. They subpoenaed financial records. Investigators interviewed business owners. Fire specialists examined the remains. Detectives compared motorcycle sightings with security footage. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Then Dad remembered something else. 3 days before the fire, Victor had asked him whether his son still worked in the military. Dad had laughed it off at the time. Now he understood why the question mattered. They had been checking whether anyone would come after them. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't interested in becoming their enemy. I was interested in becoming the person who made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. That difference would matter, but while we were building our case, Victor wasn't sitting still. He knew someone had begun asking questions. One evening, my father's phone rang. He answered. Nobody spoke. Then a distorted voice said, "You should have taken the money." The call ended. Dad looked at me. "They're scared." I shook my head. "No, they're testing us. And if they were testing us, what would they do when they realized we weren't going to back down?" The next morning, Dad refused to leave his temporary workshop. He had rented a small industrial unit after the fire, and he was determined to keep repairing engines despite having almost nothing left. I arrived before sunrise and found him already working beneath the hood of an old Chevrolet. "You should be sleeping," I told him. "You should be working," he replied. That was my father. Even after losing nearly everything, he still believed the answer to hardship was to put your hands on something broken and start fixing it. I helped him for an hour before Detective Bennett called. She said investigators had identified the biker who had poured the accelerant around the garage. His name was Mason Cole. He had a history of intimidation, assault, and property crimes. More importantly, he had recently received a large payment from an account connected to Carlton Shaw. The investigators had enough to bring him in for questioning. Mason arrived with an attorney and denied everything. He claimed he had been nowhere near the garage. Then Bennett showed him a security image from a gas station 20 minutes before the fire. Mason's face was visible. His motorcycle was visible. His jacket was visible. His attorney went silent. Mason still denied involvement. Then Bennett placed another photograph on the table. It showed him meeting Victor the previous afternoon. Mason looked at it and realized something terrible. He wasn't being interrogated about a theory anymore. He was being confronted with a timeline. Eventually, he admitted that Victor had ordered him to send a message. He claimed he never intended the garage to burn completely. He said Victor wanted the building damaged enough to force Dad out. That confession opened the door to everything else. Investigators obtained warrants and began searching financial records, properties, vehicles, and business accounts connected to the club. They found payments. They found communications. They found evidence of intimidation, and then they found something none of us expected, a second planned attack. The target was another business owner who had refused to sell his property. His name was Raymond Ellis. He owned a small hardware store 2 miles from my father's garage. When investigators contacted him, Raymond admitted that 2 men had followed his daughter home from work. They had threatened his family. He had been considering leaving town. Dad was furious. "They did this to more than me," he said. I could hear the anger in his voice. "They've been doing it to everyone." That became the turning point. The story was no longer about one burned garage. It was about a network of intimidation that had operated because people were too afraid to stand together. So Detective Bennett arranged a meeting with several victims. They came quietly, one by one: a diner owner, a mechanic, a hardware store owner, a landscaping contractor. Each told the same story: threats, payments, fear, property offers. Then one elderly woman said something that changed the room. "I thought I was alone." Dad looked around the table. "You're not." And for the first time since the fire, I saw something stronger than anger in his eyes. I saw purpose. But the evidence still had one missing piece, and finding it would put the entire operation at risk. The missing piece was Carlton Shaw himself. He had been careful. His name appeared nowhere directly in the payments. He used intermediaries, shell companies, and verbal instructions. But people who think they're untouchable eventually become careless. Investigators discovered that Shaw had arranged a private meeting with Victor at an abandoned warehouse outside the county. They couldn't simply rush in. They needed lawful surveillance and enough evidence to connect Shaw directly to the crimes. So they watched. They documented. They waited. I stayed out of the operation, except when Detective Bennett needed background information about the military equipment visible in one of the videos. The truth was, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see Victor realize what he'd done, but I also knew that if I crossed a line, I could destroy the case my father had spent weeks helping build. So I stayed home. That night, Dad and I sat in the temporary workshop eating sandwiches from a paper bag. He looked around at the rented walls and sighed. "You know what hurts most?" he asked. "The tools can be replaced. The building can be rebuilt. It's the photographs." I understood. He had kept pictures of my mother, my childhood, my first day in uniform, and my return from overseas. All gone. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were digital prints I'd recovered from an old family backup drive. Dad stared at them. His hands trembled. "You saved these?" "Some of them." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he pulled me into a hug. My father wasn't a man who hugged often. That one lasted longer than either of us expected. The next morning, Detective Bennett called. Shaw had made a mistake. He had contacted a bank using one of the same accounts investigators had already flagged. That created the financial link they needed. Shortly afterward, investigators obtained additional records tying him to the development company and the payments to Victor's club. The case moved quickly after that. Warrants were executed, vehicles were searched, computers were seized, several suspects were arrested. Victor Raines disappeared. For 3 days, nobody knew where he was. Then a state investigator found him in a neighboring county. He wasn't hiding in some dramatic underground bunker. He was staying in a cheap motel under a false name, watching news coverage and trying to figure out how much the investigators knew. When officers arrested him, he reportedly asked one question: "Was Mercer behind this?" The officer didn't answer. Victor had finally realized the old mechanic he'd threatened had a son who understood patience better than he understood intimidation. But the arrest wasn't the end. Victor still had people outside. And one of them had been watching my father. The warning came that same evening when Dad found an envelope taped to the door of his temporary workshop. Inside was a photograph of the garage before the fire. Across the back, someone had written 6 words, "You should have walked away." Dad read it twice. Then he looked at me. I didn't need to ask what he was thinking. The question was no longer whether they would stop, it was whether they had one final move planned. They did. Detective Bennett discovered that the message had come from an associate of Victor named Dale Mercer, no relation to us. Dale had not been arrested because his name hadn't appeared in the first round of evidence, but surveillance showed him meeting with 2 other men connected to the club. Investigators believed they intended to intimidate another witness before that witness could testify. The witness was Raymond Ellis, the hardware store owner. Raymond had agreed to cooperate after learning that other victims were standing with him. Now he was frightened again. Bennett arranged protection and moved him temporarily. Dad insisted on visiting him. When they met, Raymond looked exhausted. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. Dad put a hand on his shoulder. "Neither did I." Raymond looked up. "What changed?" Dad answered simply. "I realized being afraid doesn't make them right." Those words spread through the community. More victims came forward. More records surfaced. The development company suspended its project. Shaw was arrested. Victor faced multiple charges. The biker club began collapsing from within as members realized the money and influence they thought protected them were gone. But one problem remained: the fire itself. The insurance company questioned whether Dad had been fully truthful about the contents of the garage. They wanted documentation for every major loss. Dad nearly laughed when he heard that. "They burned my garage, and now they want receipts for the ashes." I helped him reconstruct the inventory from old invoices, photographs, customer records, and tax documents. It took weeks. We built the claim piece by piece. Eventually, the insurer approved the majority of it. Dad received enough to begin rebuilding. He didn't rebuild the old garage exactly as it had been. He made it larger, brighter. He added a steel sign over the entrance with his name on it. Underneath, he added a smaller line. Established 1982, still standing. The day the sign went up, the entire street seemed to notice. People who had once been afraid began bringing their vehicles back. Raymond reopened his hardware store. The diner owner returned to work. The landscaping company reopened. What had started as a campaign of fear had accidentally created a community that refused to be intimidated. Months later, the trial began. I sat beside Dad in the courtroom. Victor entered wearing a suit instead of his biker colors. He looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the room. Maybe it was the realization that nobody was afraid of him anymore. The prosecution presented the evidence: video, financial records, witness testimony, fire investigation results, communications. The defense tried to argue coincidence. It didn't work. When the verdict finally came, Victor and his associates were convicted on multiple charges. Shaw was convicted as well. Dad didn't celebrate. He simply closed his eyes for a moment. "It's over," he whispered. I knew what he meant. Not that the past had disappeared. It hadn't. But the people who had tried to erase our future had failed. Then the judge asked Dad whether he wanted to make a statement. He stood slowly and looked toward the defendants. Everyone expected anger. Instead, he said something nobody expected. "You burned my building. You didn't burn my life." Then he sat down, and I realized that my father's greatest victory had never been revenge. It was refusing to become the kind of man his enemies wanted him to be. A year after the fire, the new garage opened. The first customer through the door was Raymond Ellis, carrying a broken lawnmower engine under one arm and a grin on his face. "Thought I'd bring you something to fix," he said. Dad laughed so hard he had to sit down. The new building smelled like fresh paint, rubber, metal, and coffee. Sunlight poured through the windows. The walls carried framed photographs of the old garage, including one blackened picture recovered from the ruins. Dad kept it behind his desk. He said he wanted to remember what happened, not because he enjoyed the pain, but because forgetting would make the lesson disappear. I visited every few weeks. Sometimes we worked together. Sometimes we sat outside and watched traffic pass. One afternoon, He asked me if I regretted getting involved. I thought about the fire, the threats, the investigation, the months of uncertainty. No, I said, but I regret that you had to lose everything before people believed you. Dad nodded. That's how fear works. It convinces everyone that silence is safer. He looked at the busy street. Until someone refuses to stay silent. That sentence stayed with me. The story eventually spread beyond our town. People online called me a hero because of my military background. I never accepted that description. I didn't storm into the club's headquarters. I didn't hunt anyone down. I didn't turn my training into a weapon against civilians. The real victory came from evidence, investigators, witnesses, and a community that finally decided fear wasn't stronger than truth. My father used to tell me that every machine gives you information if you're patient enough to listen. Engines knock before they fail. Belts squeal before they snap. Bearings grind before they seize. People are no different. The signs were there long before the garage burned. We just didn't know how to read them. Months later, Detective Bennett stopped by the new garage. She handed Dad a small metal box. Inside was a piece of the original sign, blackened around the edges but still recognizable. Dad stared at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Under the old office floor," she said. Dad placed it on the counter. Then he looked at me. "You know what we're going to do with it?" I shook my head. He pointed toward the new entrance. "Mount it beside the new sign." So we did. The burned piece became part of the building, not hidden, not repaired, not erased, a reminder. The black vultures thought fire would make my father leave. Instead, they gave him a reason to rebuild stronger than before, and they thought destroying his garage would break his family. Instead, it brought us closer. The final chapter came 2 years later, when the garage celebrated its anniversary. Dad stood beneath the sign, surrounded by customers, friends, neighbors, and the people who had once been too afraid to speak. He raised a coffee cup and said, "To everyone who stood up." Everyone raised theirs. I looked at my father, and realized something I'd missed the night of the fire. He hadn't needed his son to come home and destroy his enemies. He needed his son to remind him that the world was bigger than the people who had hurt him. Justice had done the rest. That evening, after everyone left, Dad and I stood alone outside the garage. The parking lot was quiet. The new sign was glowing above us. I could still remember the first night I'd seen the old building burning, the orange light reflecting off the windshield of my truck, my father's silhouette standing in the smoke. Back then, I thought the story would end with punishment. I thought justice meant watching the people responsible lose everything. But standing there years later, I understood something different. Justice wasn't the destruction of an enemy. Justice was restoration. It was Raymond reopening his store. It was the diner owner hiring new employees. It was my father putting his tools back on a wall. It was a community learning that intimidation only works when everyone believes they're alone. Dad looked at me. "You know what I kept from the old garage?" he asked. I smiled. "The coffee machine." He laughed. "That too." Then he reached into his pocket and handed me a small brass key. "The office." I looked at it. "You're giving me the office?" "I'm getting older." He shrugged. "Someone needs to keep the books." I laughed because the thought of me doing accounting was almost absurd. But I accepted the key, not because I wanted the business, because I understood what it represented. My father had built something with his hands, lost it to violence and rebuilt it without becoming violent himself. That was the legacy he was actually giving me. Not a building. Not a garage. Not a collection of tools. A lesson. Never let someone else's cruelty decide what kind of person you become. Never confuse anger with courage. And never underestimate what happens when ordinary people document the truth, stand together, and refuse to be intimidated. The men who burned the garage had wanted a victory they could understand. They wanted my father gone. They wanted the property. They wanted everyone else frightened enough to stay quiet. Instead, their own actions exposed them. Their money disappeared. Their influence disappeared. Their club collapsed. Their names became evidence in court records instead of whispered threats in parking lots. And my father? He was still there. Every morning, he opened the garage. Every evening, he locked the doors. Sometimes he would stand outside beneath the sign and look at that small blackened piece of the old one. I asked him once why he kept it there. He said, "Because I never want to forget that fire doesn't get the final word." Then he smiled and went back inside. I watched him disappear through the garage doors, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about the men who had burned our past. I was thinking about the future my father had built from the ashes. That was the ending they never expected. They wanted us afraid, they wanted us broken, they wanted us gone. Instead, we were still standing. And that is the part of the story I remember most. Not the flames, not the arrests, not the courtroom. Not even the moment the verdict came down. I remember my father standing beneath a brand new sign with grease on his hands, sunlight on his face, and a smile that told me everything had changed. The people who attacked him believed strength meant intimidation. They believed power meant making other people afraid. They believed destroying something was the same as winning. They were wrong. Real strength is rebuilding. Real power is having evidence when someone expects you to have only anger. Real courage is knowing you could retaliate and choosing instead to let truth, law, and persistence do the work. My military training taught me to understand dangerous situations, but my father taught me what to do after the danger passes. You rebuild. You protect what matters. You remember. You keep moving. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't watching an enemy fall. It's standing exactly where they tried to remove you from and realizing they failed. Years later, the garage is still there. The old burned piece of metal still hangs beside the entrance. New customers walk beneath it every day without knowing what it means. My father does. I do. And whenever I see it, I remember that night when everything seemed lost. I remember the heat against my face, the smell of smoke, the sound of my father's voice saying, "I saw their colors." I remember opening that metal box and realizing that the people responsible had left behind more evidence than they ever imagined. Most importantly, I remember the decision I made afterward. I could have let anger control me. I could have turned the situation into a personal war. Instead, I chose patience. I chose evidence. I chose justice. And because of that choice, my father didn't just get his garage back, he got his life back. So if there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. When someone tries to destroy what you built, don't let their actions destroy who you are. Document the truth. Protect your family. Stand beside good people. Let the evidence speak. And when the smoke clears, rebuild something stronger. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't a fist, a threat, or a weapon. Sometimes it's simply opening the doors again the next morning and refusing to stay down. My father did exactly that. And every time those garage doors rise, they tell the same story without saying a word. You can burn the building. You can damage the tools. You can create fear. But if you cannot break the people inside, you haven't won. You have only given them another reason to rise. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What kind of story do you want next? Military revenge, psychological thriller, or emotional family justice? And here's the question I want you to debate. If you were in my shoes, knowing what those men had done to your family, would you have waited for investigators and let the legal system handle everything, or would you have been tempted to take justice into your own hands? Tell me what you would have chosen and why. And if this story kept you listening until the end, stay with us for the next one. More stories of loyalty, justice, betrayal, courage, and the moments when ordinary people discover they are stronger than the people standing against them. Until then, take care of yourself, protect the people you love, and remember, when everything burns down, you can still choose what you build next.
ਸਮਾਨ ਤੇਰੇ ਇੱਕ ਦਾ ਸੰਗ ਵੱਜ ਗਿਆ ਤੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਰਹਿਣਾ ਬੀਬੀ ਬਾਲੀ ਇਹ ਬਾਲੀ ਇਹ ਬੜੀ ਨਾ ਇਹ ਬਰੂਗਾ
Okay.